And I want to welcome you to this commemoration. We've been doing it annually since 1980, a commemoration of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I also want to say a word of thanks to our co-sponsors, the Fellowship in Prayer, and the Program on Science and Global Security at Princeton University. We're very honored tonight to have the grandson of a survivor of the atomic bombing. Many years that we've had our commemoration, I was telling a reporter a little earlier, we've had actual people who are survivors. In Japan, they're called hibakusha, all right? That's the Japanese word for a survivor of the bombing, and it's tragic that they had to invent a word for that, but, and they have gotten, as they've aged, and of course many of them are in poor health as well, it's gotten more and more difficult for them to travel here to give us their testimony firsthand. And so we're very honored now tonight that we have Yuichi Yokoyama, who is the grandson of a survivor of the Hiroshima bombing. And he is also a graduate student at Fordham, not far from here, and his parents are here all the way from Japan. So we're very honored to have you here too. So Yuichi, come and speak for us, please.
I feel really honored and happy to be here with you all. Around several months ago, Reverend Moore and the organization Coalition for Peace Action offered me this great opportunity to talk to you as a speaker at this commemoration. Since then, I have been always looking forward to meeting you all today. Before beginning my speech, let me introduce my parents. So they came here all the way from my hometown, Hiroshima, and now sitting over there. Please give them a round of applause as welcome to Princeton. Thank you very much. Tonight, I want to share just two stories with you. Although the topics are different from each other, I'll talk about them in the same manner, through talking about myself. I am not talking about the survivors' sentiments on the bombings on behalf of them. Neither am I talking about the Japanese opinions as a delegate of Japan. I am me. Simply as I am, I want to share with you what I have had in my own heart through my life. The first story is what comes to my heart when I think of peace. When I was 15 years old, my mother told me my grandmother had been exposed to radiation in Hiroshima after the bombing. Okay, so what? Even after that, I didn't care the fact that my grandmother is a hibakusha. I thought of it as just a problem of science and technology, medicine, politics, or whatever. I also felt it really natural for Hiroshima people like me to have someone affected by the bombing in the families. However, my feeling toward it gradually changed. Soon after I knew about my grandmother, I fell in love with a girl. She was not from Hiroshima, but from other part of Japan. We were traveling in a big group of students. In the group, there was a guy who was so interested in radiation that he was always measuring radiation intensity everywhere we went. When he was talking about radiation, I said to them by chance, "Actually, my grandma is a hibakusha." That girl and the radiation guy, got so surprised. Seeing a girl whom I loved so much getting that surprised made me realize for the first time that there was a world where living with a survivor is unnatural. I was so shocked. I came back home with that shock still in my mind. In a bookshelf of my house, I found a novel, Black Rain. The story is about a man, Mr. Shigematsu, who is struggling to prove that his niece Yasuko was not in the city at the time of the bombing. Every time Yasuko is proposed a marriage arrangement, the Broom family declines to welcome her as a bride when they hear a rumor that Yasuko was A-bomb affected. One day, they proposed a really good arrangement, and Shigematsu made all his efforts to prove Yasuko's intactness. But she came down with A-bomb illness, and the proposed match was broken off accordingly. I got so frightened after reading the novel. I had never imagined this kind of social intolerance existed, and I feared that the same kind of thing might happen to me in some future. What would I do if the parents of my girlfriend, whom I love, say they don't want to accept me as their daughter's groom because I'm a grandson of a survivor? I felt so scary. Since then, I always have had this anxiety nagging in my heart. Actually, there's an academic paper published in 2007 by a research center located in Hiroshima saying that there's no statistically significant correlation between the parents' radiation exposure and their children's health. But I don't necessarily think this paper easily changes people's way of thinking about hibakshas. Certainly, academic research is really important. It helps us humans search for agreeably objective truth by presenting a reliable hypothesis. However, for example, do smokers stop smoking because it is academically proved that it is bad for health? Do people drop all their prejudices and stop discriminating others because of some academic proof? I doubt that. How we deal with those researches is our own problem. By thinking in this way through myself, my view on the atomic bombing and nuclear weapons decisively changed. I realized that dealing with the bombings and the weapons is not only the matter of science and technology, medicine, or politics. It's not the problem that should be dealt with only by scientists, doctors, and politicians. It's not the problem of others. It is the problem of us, the whole humanity. The problem lies in how humanity tackles all the challenges that the nuclear weapons may pose, and those challenges include social and cultural intolerance against hibakshas. This is what comes up to me, firstly, when I think of peace. My second story is about talking about peace. 7 years ago, soon after my mother told me about my grandmother, my high school teacher introduced me a student exchange program between Israel, Palestine, and Japan. The project was launched in that year to invite high school students from Israel, Palestine, and Japan to both Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the year of 60th anniversary of the bombings, and let the participants have dialogues toward peace. For me, welcoming all those students to Hiroshima meant I needed to guide them as a Hiroshima local. I thought of the project as a valuable opportunity to consider how should I think of the fact that I am a grandson of a survivor. I decided to take part in it. In the project, we talked about peace together while going to the memorial museums in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, listening to a hibakusha, and participating in the commemoration ceremonies. During the project, discussions on peace left me a strong impression. Some students from Israel thought of the meaning of peace as security, while some students from Palestine thought of it as freedom. There's a decisive difference between them. Security for one group is enhanced by several hundred-mile-long physical separation walls that prevent terrorist suspects from coming into their land. On the other hand, freedom of those people who are suspected as terrorists is imperiled by the same walls. By using the same word peace, they were talking about the opposite things. There arose a furious quarrel between the participants. Japanese staff couldn't stop that. Since then, every time I talk about peace with every person, I've got so surprised at how peace can be for each individual. Our definitions of peace naturally differ. Everyone in this world is a unique individual, and everyone looks through the lens of his or her own personality, background, and experiences. That's why everyone thinks of the same word peace so differently. If each of us tries to impose each definition of peace on others as a right definition, there may well be quarrels or conflicts. But what if we admit every one of us is all looking at peace through the lens of each one's own hurt, and share what consists of those lenses? We would be able to deepen our understanding of peace through each other. I do believe one of the most beautiful things about peace is that each individual thinks of peace differently. I love talking about peace. That's what I have been looking forward to today. Now I'm speaking here in front of you, but I didn't come here only to speak to you. Let me listen to you later. After all the speeches by all the presenters, I'm looking forward to knowing you and your own view on the piece. At the last of my speech, I would like to thank my grandmother, my family, and my friends, all who have been supporting my peace journey in every possible way. And again, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the Coalition for Peace Action for giving me this valuable opportunity to be here as a speaker, and you all for listening to me. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Yuichi. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And we are going to be having a minute of silence to remember what happened there and to renew our commitment to never letting it happen again. To help us lead into that, could the Reverend Laura Craig come? And she is an interfaith minister with Fellowship and Prayer, one of our co-sponsors, so we thought this would be a nice lead-in to that minute of silence.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Reverend Laura Craig from Fellowship and Prayer, and I'm honored to be with all of you tonight. Fellowship and Prayer was founded in 1949 by Carl Evans and Catherine Brown as a prayer response to the first use of nuclear weapons. Persons of all faiths were urged to form and pray in fellowship circles in an effort to bring peace to our world. But in order to attain world peace, I maintain we need to be first at peace within our own hearts. Each of us must strive to forgive and ask for forgiveness, to reconcile with others and not cause harm. We must not pray for peace. We must pray to become peace. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said, "Our world has greatly changed. Modern technology and our global economy have made it much smaller. We are now interdependent, and the whole concept of war is outdated. Although its concept may be outdated, the reality is war is still with us. Horror and devastation from nuclear bombs as inflicted upon Japan 67 years ago are still a threat to humanity today. And so we pray. Divine wisdom, we ask you to guide us. Assist us to eradicate nuclear weapons. Help us search for life-giving methods to resolve conflicts. May we gain new insights to better understand today's complex issues. We pray tonight for open hearts, open minds, integrity, and truth. We pray for our speakers, our moderator, and the sincere efforts of all. We pray to become peace. Amen.
Amen.
And our third speaker is actually one of my oldest colleagues at Princeton. We came here almost together a very long time ago. It's been 15 years now. And who is MD Ramana, who is originally from India and works with me at the program on thinking about the dangers of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy in South Asia. And he's going to actually talk about some of the incredibly heroic struggles that are taking place in India right now on the nuclear issue. But I think one thing I want to, my one penny's worth here, is that one of the things that I've asked the panelists to talk about is not just what's happening there, but how it is connected to what the United States is doing and what it should be doing. So with that, I'll ask our first speaker, Pervez Hoodbhoy.
Thank you, Zia. Many of you must have read in the New York Times or Washington Post or elsewhere that Pakistan has the fastest growing nuclear arsenal in the world. It's roughly at the rate of 10 bombs per year that are being produced. And if this rate of growth is correct, then it shall make Pakistan's arsenal equal to that of Britain's within the next 10 years or so. Now, of course, one does not know whether what is reported in newspapers here in the United States is actually correct or not, but it has not been denied by the Pakistani government, and in fact, it has been acknowledged as it has been taken rather proudly. What I want to talk about is why this is happening and the implications of this. Now, the reason that Pakistan had made its nuclear weapons in the first place was because India tested first in 1974 and then again in 1998. Pakistan, being a smaller country, felt threatened by a much larger neighbor with which it has had several wars. And so, in a sense, one can understand, even if one cannot justify, the acquisition of nuclear weapons by Pakistan. It was a response to what India was doing. Well, earlier on, the thought was that every Indian nuke had to be met with a Pakistani nuke. But as nuclear weapons came into production, and then when they were tested in 1998, a new kind of thinking started in the Pakistani military. That thinking was that now we have a force equalizer. Now, in spite of the fact that India is a much larger country, yet we can do things that we would otherwise not have been able to do. Now, as you know, there is a major issue over land, the land of Kashmir. Both Pakistan and India claim it. And to change facts on the ground has been very difficult, in fact, impossible for Pakistan, in spite of it having waged secret wars, first in 1965 and then later by supporting insurgencies and you could say proxy war. So after the nuclear tests, the thinking was that maybe we can equalize things, and so under the cover of nuclear weapons, a secret invasion was launched in the area of Kashmir called Kargil. It turned out to be unsuccessful. Pakistan got a bloody nose, and yet the same behavior persisted. So it was not nuke for nuke, it was that there was a different way by which Pakistan could now look at India. Well, now there is yet another way that Pakistani generals are looking at their nuclear weapons. And this, in fact, does not have very much to do with India. Of course, the old reasons exist. There is fear of India. But this new reason has to do more with the United States than anything else. The reason that nuclear weapons are being produced at this frantic pace is because Pakistani generals, the military, and in fact, the country is seeing the United States as a potential adversary, as one that is a threat that may be as large as that of India. And there is a fear, a very palpable fear within the military that at some point, just as Osama bin Laden had been snatched away and killed, Pakistani nuclear weapons will be susceptible to lightning strikes by American special forces. Therefore, in the interest of having redundancy, more and more of them shall be made. They shall be hidden inside tunnels, they shall be hidden inside caves, hidden perhaps within cities themselves, and it shall be made so difficult that the Americans will have no clue of where to look for, and even if they know where to look, it's going to involve a bloody firefight. And since nuclear armed countries have never gone to war against each other, therefore, this will provide the maximum degree of security to Pakistan's nuclear weapons. Now, this is a reason that is not very often mentioned. In fact, it's never mentioned in Pakistan, but it's implicit, it's there. This is why Pakistan has repeatedly blocked the fissile material cutoff treaty talks at the Conference of Disarmament at Geneva. And although it says that Pakistan must make more nuclear weapons because the United States entered into a special agreement with India, the US-India nuclear deal, and that these weapons are meant for India alone, there's another reason which is offered, which is that India has prepared an action plan in which it would make lightning strikes into Pakistani territory. In order to counter that, the Pakistanis say that they need tactical nuclear weapons so that if a tank formation enters from the Indian side into Pakistan, they would use tactical nuclear weapons against those tanks on Pakistani soil, and this would not constitute a use of nuclear weapons against an adversary on that side. So they say we need more nuclear weapons. To make more nuclear weapons, we need more fissile material, and that is why we must block the talks in Geneva. Now, these are the reasons that are officially given by Pakistan. But what I'm telling you is what's below the surface, and which I feel is at least part of the reason why this production is proceeding at such a frantic pace. Now, as I told you earlier, I don't really know whether these weapons are being produced in the numbers that they're said to be, but the evidence seems to be that the Americans, and what you read in the Washington Post and New York Times is probably not wrong, because A, the government doesn't deny it, B, you can see from the sky that there is yet another nuclear reactor that has been added on, and that a third and a fourth reactor are being constructed, and these reactors have one and only one purpose, that is the production of plutonium for use in bombs. They have no commercial use. There's no electricity produced from those nuclear reactors. They are entirely for military purposes. So it's a bad situation, and how to get out of it is something that I don't really know, and it seems as if my time is over, whatever. So we shall leave that for the Q&A. Thank you.
So our second speaker is Professor Nayyar.
You're opening the door for what?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be able to speak to you. As soon as Indian and Pakistani governments conducted their tests in 1998, several peace movements in the two countries started. In India as well as in Pakistan, nearly came out spontaneously in so many places in each country, and all in the same direction and they said, we do not want nuclear weapons, and they were strongly anti-nuclear. In India, some of the movements, in fact, launched very, very long, thousands of miles of marches against nuclear weapons. Of course, there were also other forces, those forces which thought that that their countries have become more powerful because of nuclear weapons, and therefore they were rejoicing the acquisition of nuclear weapons. And in spite of that, these peace movements continued their march. And then many of these peace movements coalesced together in the form of peace coalitions to unify their work, to direct their energies properly. They made several suggestions to their governments. I recall that there was a suggestion of making South Asia a nuclear weapons-free zone. There was a suggestion on creating a regional fissile material production freeze in South Asia. There was a suggestion on the two countries to act to sign a no-war pact with each other. They also suggested that there should not be any deployment of nuclear weapons in the two countries, and so on. There were many suggestions. In fact, a couple of suggestions were sounded good to the two countries, and they actually agreed to work on them. One was a little older suggestion on not attacking each other's nuclear facilities, and the other one, which came from peace movements, was to sign a pact to inform each other in advance of missile tests. But other than that, there has been not much movement. There was a time when India and Pakistan both used to say at international forums that they support denuclearization of the world, and that they wanted to have complete nuclear disarmament. And in fact, they did not sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty just on account of that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was not strongly urging the nuclear weapon states to disarm. Now, after having acquired nuclear weapons, the two countries have started to think of themselves as nuclear powers and have also started to hedge on all of these demands made locally or globally. And one of them was described by Pervez a few minutes ago. I think the greatest difficulties that peace movements face in South Asia is that people see the nuclear status of South Asia and nuclearization of South Asia, or the issue of disarmament in South Asia, in relation to the global situation. They see that there is absolutely zero movement towards nuclear disarmament globally. They see that although there have been arms reduction treaties, although there is a lot of emphasis on nuclear non-proliferation, which always means that those who possess nuclear weapons will continue to possess nuclear weapons, and others will be denied nuclear weapons, and that those which possess nuclear weapons somehow tend to have sort of acquire a kind of an elevated status in the global community, like, for example, the deal that the US entered into with India, in which India has been given a seat at the nuclear suppliers group, as well as now thinking of being given a seat at the UN Security Council. So all of that actually points towards a very strange thing, which is that acquisition of nuclear weapons gives you a status, and that there is absolutely no urge among the nuclear weapon countries to disarm themselves. And hence, because of this, there was a great deal of hope in 2009 when the US president announced in Prague that the US government will go for complete nuclear disarmament, that they will move towards a world free of nuclear weapons. We thought that this would be, there would be an agenda chalked out, that there would be a program chalked out, and that there would be pressure on other countries to also acquire nuclear weapons. Instead, we see many things which go contrary to this announcement. There is a large program of refurbishment of American nuclear weapons. And of course, in spite of the START treaty, the new START treaty with Russia, nuclear weapon establishments have been given 7% enhancement in their allocations. And that, although there is a lot of noise in the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva on fissile material cutoff treaty, for which, of course, Pakistan should be blamed, and we all condemn Pakistan for not letting the negotiations go on, but we must also understand that at that forum, in spite of other things being on agenda, the focus is entirely on something which is not moving forward. There could be an effort at moving in other directions also that is not being done. And thirdly, the complete denial of any move towards the much needed and much demanded nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Although a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East is something which would include Iran, perhaps, and which might actually help Iran to solve the problem of Iran, but that is being continuously be refused, and no progress towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East is being taken up. And I think this is because of these reasons, other countries are also adamant, and because of which many of our peace movements are also facing difficulties. I think I should stop over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for inviting me to speak. It's one person from India against 3 people from Pakistan, and all of them my seniors. So I have to defer to what they have said and say, I agree with everything they have said and move on from there. When I started thinking about what I wanted to say today, I was at sort of like the crossroads that Dr. Kanter showed. You have 2 paths and you have to choose. One story could have been about what India has been doing, building up its plutonium production capacity, making more uranium, building nuclear submarines, buying all kinds of things, and so on and so forth. And that would be a kind of depressing thing to sort of end this day with. And so I thought I would start by talking a little bit about the fact that there's actually some resistance to what's happening. That the people of India are not synonymous with the government of India. The two should not be confused. So I thought I would sort of say a few words about what's been happening in the last 15 years since the nuclear tests. There has been a long history of sort of people who were opposed to nuclear weapons in general, who were for peace, and this is something you would expect in the land of Mahatma Gandhi and so on. But really speaking, if you wanted to talk about an anti-nuclear or a peace movement, it really started in earnest only after the 1998 nuclear weapons tests. And the tests were, as Dr. Nayyar sort of talked about, did lead to all kinds of responses, fairly spontaneous, across the countries, both in Pakistan and in India. And what was interesting was that unlike what you might see in the United States today, the groups that came out against the nuclear test, there were a small number who were formed almost immediately after the test, who were primarily focused on nuclear weapons. Many of them were sort of journalists against nuclear weapons, or the movement in India for nuclear disarmament in Delhi, and so on. But the large number of them were groups which were active on various social issues. They could be education, health, women's issues, and so on and so forth, who immediately saw that trying to take on these nuclear weapons is something which is part of their mandate, part of their agenda. That trying, as a country that's going to try to build nuclear weapons when millions of people lacked all kinds of basic things, is not a country that's going to be helping any of their causes. And so in about a couple of years, many of these groups sort of came together to form a national coalition called the Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace. And there were about 250 different member organizations that came together. And as I said, many of them were, groups which were involved in other kinds of issues. And I want to sort of move on quickly from that. And I can sort of talk about the kinds of policy proposals and the various actions that they took. They sort of mirror, to some extent, what Professor Nayyar was talking about. So I'm not going to sort of repeat that. Instead, I'm going to move on to something else which is sort of more contemporary, which is that one of the early sort of, shall we say, divisions within this coalition. This is a very broad coalition, as you can imagine. And there were all kinds of tensions, and I'll come back to that. But one issue that sort of came up almost immediately was that there was a history of people who had groups, people's groups which had resisted nuclear power in the country, building up nuclear reactors, mining of uranium, and so on and so forth. And the question that sort of presented itself before this Coalition for Nuclear Disarmament and Peace was, are we going to take a stance about nuclear power or not? And initially, one argument was, no, we should keep our eyes on the ball. This is the most important danger at this point, and we are not going to talk about nuclear reactors. That's going to divide us, and so on and so forth. But immediately, or after a few years, it sort of became clearer and clearer that this was not a stance that was very stable. It could not be sustained. And this is partly for two reasons. One is that it's the same organization, the so-called Department of Atomic Energy in India, that was involved in both the nuclear weapons and the nuclear energy production. And the Department of Atomic Energy had essentially this kind of two rationales that it sort of played against each other as and when it suited it. On the one hand, if you're sort of confronted with people who are saying, India should never acquire nuclear weapons and so on, they would say, we are not about making nuclear weapons. We want to make energy for development. We need energy. We need electricity and so on. And when somebody points out to them that, look, you have not really made much electricity, whatever your electricity you're making is expensive and so on, they say, no, we are in the business of safeguarding the nation. We are going to provide national security. So this is sort of two very convenient rationales. They could use one against the other appropriately. And of course, in either of those cases, they didn't really deliver on any of them. They just had to promise that they would generate electricity, that they would give security. They didn't have to actually deliver on any of them, right? The second aspect, which is important, was that the governments that had come to rule India, and this sort of cut across party lines in some sense, they all were in the business of doing all kinds of things that were against the people's interests, the common people's interests, whether it was building nuclear weapons or nuclear reactors or the kind of large-scale economic liberalization and the kind of impacts that it has. They were all done by the same government, so how can you possibly oppose them on one and sort of support them on the other? It was very, very difficult. So for these kind of reasons, eventually this coalition sort of came to oppose nuclear power as well. And I'm just going to give you like 2 minutes sort of clip on something which is happening as we speak in a sense, which is a struggle over a nuclear reactor that's being built in southern India in a place called Kudankulam in Tamil Nadu. This is essentially in the very southern tip of India, very close to Sri Lanka. You can sort of see this little sort of windrows diagrams that point out there. It's a reactor which has a long history. It was originally supposed to be imported from the Soviet Union in 1988, and the project was frozen after the Soviet Union broke up. And eventually in 1998, after the nuclear test, this is kind of the Russia's reward for India testing nuclear weapons, as it were, the project was revived. And at that point, it was expected that it's going to go to be commissioned by 2007 and 2008. And alongside the construction of this nuclear power plant, ever since it was conceived of, there was a movement that built up around it, trying to oppose it. So way back in 1989, there was a huge demonstration of over 10,000 people, organized mostly by fish workers, who were concerned that the hot water and the radioactivity that would be released by the nuclear reactor would affect their fish catch. And this resulted, as one would expect, in police action. The police fired on them. It's rumored that one person died. It's never confirmed. But fortunately or unfortunately, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the deal collapsed at that point, and so the movement went into subsidence. And in 1998, when the reactor project was sort of revived, the movement again got revived. And over the years, they had tried various ways of trying to appeal to the government to say, we don't want this nuclear power plant, please go away. There was no option, there was absolutely no public forum where they could actually go and have their opposition be recorded. The first time they could ever do something of that sort was when the environmental impact assessment was discussed in public. And I was there at that meeting. There were about 7,000 people who had come. And almost unanimously, all of them had opposed it. And this is a picture from that. But these groups had been doing this public education. And 2011, and you all remember these pictures from Fukushima, that really changed. I mean, even though there had been opposition all along, the Fukushima accidents really convinced the people that what these activists and so on had been warning about is real, right? It is not just hypothetical, it could happen. And nobody could at that point say this cannot happen. So immediately you had this huge numbers of people sort of gathering in public places, and the movement really sort of sprung up. And by October of that year, they had actually blockaded the plant, not allowing any workers to go in to complete the construction. Fishermen, on the other hand, had come from the sea and tried to sort of just as a symbolic action. It's all completely peaceful. Non-violent, not peaceful exactly. The government's response was kind of typical. Before there was supposed to be some local elections in March of this year. Before that, the chief minister of the state said, I am among you, I'll be among you, I'll support you. If you don't want this project, I will not have this be commissioned. But the elections ended, she won, and she immediately changed her position. Not surprising, huh? And the way she did it was also in a fairly familiar fashion. What they did was they got a group of experts to come and say, can you look at this plant and tell us if it's safe or not? And of course, if you pick the right experts, they will tell you that it is safe. And so that's what they did. And so as the chief minister basically changed her mind, she started this draconian police action. Thousands of cases launched against each of these. Many of the leaders have like hundreds of cases against them. Some of the charges are really serious. For example, things about sedition, waging war against the country, some of which could be sort of punished by the death penalty. And so the people there are in a really bad state at this point. It's not been commissioned yet, but it's expected to be commissioned at any point. I will end with basically three sort of lessons which we've sort of seen in the anti-nuclear movement in India. The three tensions have been among the movement. This is not among the governments, right? So one question is whether these movements should be engaging in sort of narrow arms control issues. Should they be trying to do analysis of potential arms control measures or not? Or should they just say, we are not in this business of doing that. You guys figure out how you're going to get rid of your nuclear weapons. We just want you to get rid of it, right? And we want you to commit to doing that. So a complete abolition versus doing this partial arms control measures. A second is this question of, which I talked about, do you oppose nuclear weapons alone, or do you also link it with nuclear energy? And that's the one tension which probably has been sort of resolved in India. And the last is, which I haven't had time to talk about, is whether the struggle against nuclear weapons should be left by itself or should be linked with broader peace issues. I'll stop there. Thank
you. Is this being introduced into the educational system? Well, And I think this actually ties in a little bit to what we just heard as sort of underlying the reasons why nuclear weapons are so important to the peoples of South Asia, or at least some of the peoples in South Asia. It's interesting when you ask people now, and Physicians for Social Responsibility goes out and does talks, whether people think nuclear weapons are a problem right now, and the answer is no, they don't. And it's really a lack of education. And so there is a certain amount of just naivete when it comes to that fact that we are on the brink at any moment of killing the entire planet. And it's really on hair trigger alert. I mean, these weapons could be launched in a moment's notice. And in between India and Pakistan, the warning time is even shorter than it was between Russia and the United States. But I think what it really gets to is the fact that you can't narrowly look at this as a single problem of just nuclear weapons. If it wasn't for nuclear weapons, it would be something else that we try to kill each other with. That it's a misunderstanding about what is the true nature of security and about the planet and the interconnectedness of the planet and how we have to work together to save it. So I think, and it's not, even if we don't blow ourselves up from nuclear weapons, climate change and everything else, we're going to kill each other. So it's all the same thing, that we have to dramatically change the way we think. And I think if we talk about the educational system as one in which we need to get these main principled values back into the education system about resolving conflict, about the interconnectedness, about the need to have responsibility for future generations, then these other topics will fall out of that. Nuclear power will be seen as uneconomical, dangerous, and counterproductive for future generations. Nuclear weapons will be seen as suicidal, and so on. But we need to, change the value system of our education system, and yet also don't forget the facts, which is that just, one nuclear submarine, which is only 1/3 of the U.S. Tripod for nuclear weapons, has enough to destroy, the planet many times over. So we can't forget the details, but we do need to have a new values-based curriculum to address these problems.
My question is, how does Israel fit into all this?
Well, Israel doesn't fit in directly into the India-Pakistan conflict. Israel is, of course, much more on India's side. It is a major contributor to India's defense industry, and it doesn't have relations with Pakistan at all. It is not viewed in very friendly terms by Pakistan. But I wouldn't say that Israel is any significant factor between India and Pakistan. Of course, I should say that there is a fear within Pakistan that should a conflict begin, that Israel would put its weight behind India. And at the time of the 1998 nuclear tests, there was a fear within Pakistan that just as it was about to test its nuclear weapons, that Israel would attack. Of course, this was just fiction. There's no truth behind it. But the immediacy of testing was increased by pointing towards Israel.
I asked Dr. Nayyar to comment on this question also, because he talked about this issue of the lack of the way in which countries with nuclear weapons are treated by the United States. Nayyar?
Well, I've already made that point, and I think the thing is that in the case of people, when you look at the total perception of people in South Asia, especially in Pakistan, and some other countries also, they see a very special consideration being given to Israel and very special exemptions being given to Israel compared to other countries. So, for example, Iran, there is an action against Iran. And if you ask me, I would also say that, yes, the kind of technology Iran is acquiring, certainly if it is not controlled in a proper manner, anybody in future, if not these rulers, anybody in future could turn all of that into nuclear weapons, and therefore that will be a big disaster in that region, and therefore that should not happen. However, the way that is being singled out and way Israel is being given protection, and the way the very sensible suggestion of creating a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, for which nearly all the Middle Eastern countries are ready except for Israel, is something which irks people. I think people are very worried about that.
They would begin to do what Obama was promising in 2009 and has been promised really in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is to actually begin to have a plan towards global nuclear disarmament. Is this being discussed in India and Pakistan at all? Is there any support for this kind of idea?
Ramana?
Maybe we can start with Dr. Ramana.
I assume there would be a lot of support. I don't know that there is actually discussion about this. To be truthful, this is the first I'm hearing of this. So I can't say that there is actually a lot of support. But I'm sure that among civil society groups, any initiative like that would be supported.
Oh, I don't think it would have much relevance in Pakistan because it sees its nuclear weapons, first of all, directed against India, but now there's also the new factor that I've talked about. And the idea of global disarmament simply doesn't catch on over there.
Well, I think people, as I've seen in discussing with people are not particularly enthused by nuclear non-proliferation treaty because of the old thinking that this is discriminatory and this has not yet touched those countries which have large arsenals and has not promised disarmament completely. This is certainly a feeling that exists, and therefore, if it is going to remain confined to strengthening non-proliferation treaty, the enthusiasm will be very low.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put it that way. The idea of this conference would be to go beyond the Non-Proliferation Treaty to a real plan for a global.
I'm sure that will be very welcome by the peace movements in Pakistan as well as in India, I think. Globally also, I'm sure.
I was thinking that during my day job, I'm at Columbia University, and I spend most of my time working in Africa on the Millennium Development Goals. And there's a direct connection between human development on one side and militarism and the kind of spending and dangerous things we've just been talking about tonight. And they're diametrically opposed to one another. And I think actually there's a couple of things that I take heart in. One, I think it's becoming more and more clear that the leadership of not only this country but countries around the world do not act in the best interest of their citizens, and that the nuclear industrial complex, which links together the nuclear power and the nuclear weapons and the oil, petroleum, energy sectors, are definitely working for their self-preservation and not for the preservation of the planet. So there's more of an understanding that the solutions are not going to come through the standard ways of expecting treaties and governments to come with the right answers. The right answers are definitely going to come from the people. And the people are going to have to insist that those governments respond to their needs. Now, the other area that just happened recently that's quite positive is that the International Society of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society, International Society for Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies or something like that, just voted in their international sort of federation to support the abolition of nuclear weapons on the humanitarian grounds that there is absolutely no way that a Red Cross Society could respond to a nuclear weapon detonation. Now, if we look at what we have heard as the real underlying causes of people wanting nuclear weapons, which is ultimately about fear, it's about the desire to protect themselves, to elevate themselves against their, for some sense of security against their neighbors or their enemies, is that true security comes from development and from peace and from an understanding about, having a positive future for your kids and so on. And that if we cannot ignore the fact that the subcontinent is just riven by many, many problems, which are not going to simply be solved by waving a wand around it and saying, okay, we're just going to get rid of nuclear weapons. We have to address the fundamental underlying concerns that these countries have about their security, educating them about the fact that their true security is not at the end of a gun or at the end of a nuclear weapon, but is in the humanitarian survival and environmental and development of their societies. And that we can say that it's time to redirect resources away from ways to kill each other to ways that we can survive together. And I think that the humanitarian things happening the Norwegians are going to have a conference in 2013 specifically to bring together this humanitarian view on nuclear abolition. That could lead in very nicely to the 2015 Akiba thing.